for the relationship between thought and language, and that, of course, is the logos. So the logos, as has been said already, refers to both the rational and the rational and the oratorical capacity of man. This is why we have words like logic derived from logos, but logos or login also means to say. And as far as I know, the Greek language is unique in this regard. The Greek language is the only language that has one lexical unit, one idea, one root that refers to both language and thought. Right? Even in some of the culturally closest language like Latin, of course, immediately has to use both ratio and oratio. And of course, the Romans really delighted in this false etymological wordplay. They sort of sound similar. Oratio meaning the oratorical, the verbal capacity of man. Ratio being the rational capacity of man. But the Greeks, I think, and I think if you really, there's a handful of words, if you understand them, you really get a deep insight into the nature of the Greeks. And I think logos is really at the center of this. If you understand what the word logos means, I think you understand the Greeks. And there's only a handful of concepts and words like this that I think are so central and foundation to our understanding of the Greeks. This is precisely why someone like Antisthenes is able to say precisely this, that the beginning of education, the beginning of knowledge is the investigation of words, ton onomaton episkepsis, right? It's the knowing what words mean. You're not just learning words, you're learning notions, you're learning ideas. By expanding your vocabulary, by expanding your expressive capacity, you're expanding your ability to think and to understand abstract ideas and reality. Now, I think we all have something of an intuitive sense of what the logos is in our own lives. Even though we don't have in English, we don't have a word for this. And I think we understand this because if you're thinking about what you would, like, if you'd like to make an intervention in society or in politics or in economics, what do you need to do? What is culture? What is society? Right? It's the downstream sort of sum of a series of actions of individuals. Right? So if you'd like to change society, or if you'd like to change culture, you'd like to make an impact in economics or in politics, you first need to change people's actions. Right? That's what you need to do, is change people's action. But getting people to do what you want them to do is actually very difficult. As a matter of fact, getting yourself to do what you want yourself to do is almost impossible. Anyone that's told themselves that they would go to the gym every day knows how that tends to end up. Right? So we can't even force ourselves to act in a certain way. So how do you change action? Well, the Greek insight, I think, and this is really what the logos gets at. The only way to do this is to change thought, right? Is to change thought. If you change the way you think, you can change the way you act. And I mean this in a very Aristotelian sense, right? That virtue and vice, they're habits, but they're habits of action. And so, that's maybe just putting the problem one step back. If you can't get people to act in a certain way, certainly you're not going to be able to get them to think in a certain way. How do you get someone to think in a certain way? Well, and the only way to do that is with language, right? And so this is the fundamental insight of the word logos. Why are these two things connected to one another? The Greek insight is that by refining our language, we are simultaneously refining our thoughts. And when we refine our thoughts, we improve our expressive capacity. And these two things work with one another so tightly that they become indistinguishable. I mean, of course, the Greeks even themselves knew that there was other ways to refine our thoughts, right? For example, geometry, right? Mathematics, right? These, there's a language, of course, to mathematics, but they're not verbal in the same sense that we would understand, or linguistic in the same sense that we would understand. But I think the fundamental insight of the Greeks is that there's a deep interplay between language and thought, and to refine people's thoughts, we do that by refining our language. And so, if you'd like, I mean, this maybe sort of sounds, maybe it's silly, but the power of self-suggestion, right? So if you'd like to start going to the gym every day, I mean, what's one way that you could do that? Well, you can't just force yourself to do that. You can't. But if you start speaking to yourself, it sounds almost new agey, so forgive me. But you start looking in the mirror every day and saying, "I'm an athlete, right? I'm the type." I convince you, almost brainwash yourself into thinking that you are this type of person. Eventually, your thoughts begin to coincide with the things that you say. You start thinking about yourself as a different human being, as a different sort of person. And then eventually your actions downstream from that will follow in suit, because human beings don't like living in with sort of a dissonance between our actions and between our thoughts, right? And actually that's one of the the key sources for depression is, when your actions and your thoughts don't match up with one another in some way, right? And so by turning our language to our thoughts, by changing the way that we think about ourselves, eventually we can also change the way that we act. And I think that this is, as I said, this is not something new, even though it sounds sort of new agey or sort of self-help book. I mean, this is straight out of Aristotle, right? This is the idea that the way that you develop virtue is through habits, right? And the way that you develop habits is by changing your action, and the way that you change your action is by changing the way that you think about yourself, the type of person that you are. And you do that most powerfully through language. Now, the word logos, to come back to the word logos, is incredibly powerful and important and fundamental for the development of Greek thought. The word logos, first in the works of Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic philosopher, is used to describe the soul, right? It becomes the functional equivalent of the soul, right? As a matter of fact, Heraclitus says that the function of the soul, the human soul, is the logos which increases itself. Right, for Heraclitus, there was and so Heraclitus is sometimes categorized as a material monist by Aristotle. He believed that everything was fire, but he really believed he was using fire. If you've heard about Heraclitus, you've heard everything is made of fire. Just like Thales believed that everything was made of water. What Heraclitus really believed was that the fire was just sort of the image or the metaphorical unity that he used to link things like the soul and the logos. And as a matter of fact, if you look through the fragments of Heraclitus, you'll often find the same verbs being used to describe the fire as the logos. So for Heraclitus, the fire was just sort of a metaphor to understand the logos, because what does the logos do? I mean, just like the fire, it can embrace things or comprehend things. The Greek word is katalambano, which both means to grasp, but also to understand. It means what fire does, it embraces, but also understands. And the other verb that he uses is krino, right? Krino for both the fire and the logos, because krino means to separate, right? It separate things into its constituent parts. That's what fire does when it breaks things down. But it also means to judge, right? And so for Heraclitus, the fire was sort of a convenient way to link the soul with the logos. And later in the development of the Greek tradition, you have the Stoics. The Stoics also use the word logos in the Heraclitean sense. They're very much indebted to Heraclitus and of course to Plato as well. But for the Stoics, the logos turns into the common point of divinity that links every human being to every other human being, and also to God, right? So the Stoics, for all intents and purposes, were monotheists, right? They believed, they use the word Zeus or God sort of interchangeably, and they believed that there is quite literally an image of God sort of imprinted upon each human being. And what is the nature of that image? It's the logos, right? It's the rational and oratorical, it's the rational and verbal capacity of man that links us most closely with God. There's a beautiful passage in Epictetus, who's describing everything that human beings are ready to endure to go visit the statue of Olympian Zeus at Olympia, one of the wonders of the ancient world. He describes how people are traveling, making a huge journey by foot. They're sweaty. No one's bathing. It's muddy and rainy. When they get there, they have to sleep outdoors, and they all do this to go see this beautiful work of Phidias, right? The famed sculptor. And Epictetus says that that's not necessary. That's not necessary at all. Why? Because every human being carries around inside themselves a small statue of Zeus, which is much more beautiful than any man-made statue of Zeus. And that statue of Zeus is the logos, right? And this is this idea, of course, this will be familiar to you, is as the idea that man is created in the image of God, right? That we all have the imago Dei, or the image of God, imprinted upon us. And that doesn't mean that God has a body, right? In the same way that the human beings do. But it's referring particularly to the logical and rational capacity of man. And then, of course, we have, most importantly, the beginning of the Gospel of John, Enarcheino Logos. And tomes have been written to try to understand what John means when he says that the Word was in the beginning, and equating God with the Logos. It actually, for a Greek speaker, for a native speaker of ancient Greek, the connection there would have been obvious, or it would have been intuitive why John is describing God or the soul as logos. And maybe one way to think about it is this: there's a lot of connections between the soul and logos, The word soul in English doesn't really mean anything, right? So the word soul, it's not a functional unit in the language, right? It's not connected to anything else. There are no other, maybe you have the word soulful, right? Soulfully. I can't think of any other words that are derived, that are related to the word soul. And you'd be hard pressed to, if anyone asked you what the etymology of the word soul is, why is it called soul, we wouldn't be able to tell you. But the words for soul in Greek, right, they all are related to the wind or to cold, right? So you have pneuma, right, which is the breath, right? You have psyche, right, which is related to psychos, right, which is something that's cold. And so you can imagine what's going on in the Greek world is that the Greeks are trying to figure out what tangible part of reality is most similar to the intangible reality of the soul. And the metaphor that the Greeks hit upon was that it was like the wind, right? Or it was like the wind. And why is that? Well, because the wind is incredibly powerful, right? It can knock down massive trees and destroy entire cities, but you can't see it, right? And so that's very similar to what the soul is, right? The soul is also something whose presence you cannot see, but you can feel the power of in every breath that we take. I think this is something that's, well, when we look inside, when we gaze inside ourselves, I think we're all intuitively aware that there's something in us that's more than just the sum parts of our body, right? That there's something in us that's deeper than just the sum constituents of our flesh. And what is that thing like? What is that thing like? Well, another connection between the soul and the logos is that, well, they both have wings, right? The soul, of course, has wings, and this, I'm thinking about Plato, right, in the Phaedrus or in the Phaedo, right? The soul is always conceived of as something that's able to fly, but also words have wings. You'll remember from Homer, right? The epeapteroenta, right? The winged words of the Homeric heroes. Or even, maybe you have seen this tends to be on the frontispiece of books in a library, you'll sometimes see this Latin expression, verba volans et scripta manent, right? Words fly, but the written word remains manent. Which is actually quite funny because we, in our current age that loves the written word, we interpret this as positive, right? That words, they fly away, but the written word remains forever, right? We're proud of this. For the ancients, the meaning was exactly the opposite, right? Words have wings. They fly. They fly from your mouth into the ears of your listeners, and they can change their soul, right? Whereas the written word doesn't do anything. It just remains there. It's motionless. And so we've sort of inverted in our modern world the way that we think about language. The written word has played a large role in that. But this is why when I said that there's an intuitive reason why the Greeks associate God and the soul with the logos, it's precisely this, because, well, let's say you do have this part of you that's not tangible, call it the soul, consciousness, your mind, whatever it is, something that you can't touch, something that makes up you. And the only way other human beings have to interface with that part of you, that non-tangible part of you, is their words, right? And so what's actually happening is the words, they fly out of your mouth through the air, right? Remember, the soul for the Greeks is air, right? It's breath, it's air. And they hit your eardrum, they enter into your head somehow, and they can affect your soul. So it wasn't a far stretch for the Greeks to assume that the thing that interfaces with the soul, the only thing that can interface with the non-tangible part, must be of the same constitution, of the same material, or of the same nature as the soul itself, right? So it made sense. It was not it's a very bold thing to say in archeino logos, right? That the logos was the thing that was in the beginning, but in the entire system of Greek thought, this is not something that would have been unintuitive in their understanding of the words. Even just thinking back to the Homeric phrases about words having wings and the soul having wings and the rational capacity of man. And of course, that John was writing in Ephesus at the time, right? Ephesus, of course, is the city from which hails Heraclitus, right? So he was steeped in this notion, this philosophical notion of the logos for centuries. It was the seat of Heraclitus philosophy in Ephesus. And of course, the word arche, right? So a lot of people focus in arche and logos. The logos is the hard word. Actually, the word arche is also a very difficult word to translate in this passage because arche, right, it doesn't just mean beginning, right? It means the principal point. It means a seat of power. It means also the first principle, right? So the pre-Socratic philosophers were always searching for an arche. What was the first principle of the universe? So like Thales thought that the arche of the world was water, right? Everything was made of water. Heraclitus thought the arche of the word was logos, or fire, right? And so if you're in Ephesus in the time of John, right, and you open up the Gospel of John, and he says in arche and logos, okay, I'm reading a pre-Socratic treatise about the nature of reality, right? That the arche of the world, the principle of the world, is logos, right? This wouldn't have been, I think, a particularly sort of confusing or difficult sentence for someone that speaks Greek. And while I'm on the topic here, I said that if you understand the logos, you really understand the Greeks. Another really important way to understand what makes the Greeks very important, especially Greek philosophy, is that the Greeks start with physics, right? This is unlike other philosophical systems which start with ethics. As a matter of fact, the first question that troubles the mind of the Greek philosopher is physics, is what is the world made of? The only time you get this focus on ethics, you don't get a focus on ethics until you get to Socrates. Right? Socrates is the first ethical philosopher who takes these speculations about the universe, the stars, the nature of the cosmos, and turns it into the human being. What is the nature of the human being? How do we relate to one another? This is what we would normally think about as philosophy, something of ethics. But the Greeks, and maybe one way to understand this is, for the Greeks, the entire world was infused with divinity. God and the divine was everywhere. It was in the rivers, the streams, the mountains, the ocean, the sky. And so when you turn to figure out what is the nature of reality, what is material made of, you immediately bump up against the most important questions of philosophy. What is God? What is immortality? What is the nature of the soul? What is man's relationship to the divine? And so I think to understand the Greek philosophical project and also to understand the logos, you have to understand it in this context, that the Greeks start with physics. They start with the desire to understand the nature of the world, what material is made out of, right? And only then arrive at ethics. Other philosophical systems actually tend to almost go in the reverse. And of course, there's a proto-ethics that emerges from some of the philosophical investigations of the pre-Socratics, like in Heraclitus in the 6th century. You do see a proto-ethics emerging, but for the most part, you don't get a fully fledged system of ethics, ethical inquiry, in terms of the sense of our relationship to one another as human beings until you get to Socrates. And so, to sum up, this is sort of the first question that I wanted to answer, the relationship between thought and language. And I would like to put forth that there is a deep connection. I'm much more on the side of the logos than I am of modern linguistics in establishing this connection. And I do believe that it's incredibly important. We bear an incredible responsibility in education, right, to teach children how to express themselves and how to use language well, because we're not just teaching them how to write, right? We're teaching them how to think, right? We think through words. We're certainly, at the very least, teaching them how to express their ideas. And the words that we use are so powerful in influencing the way that we think and the way that we act in the world that they can be used for incredible good. They can move us towards virtue. But also, when we neglect to teach students how to really manipulate and wield their language, the risk is always of language being used for something much more malicious and vicious. So as I transition now to the other question that I really wanted to answer is what is Greek? I'd like to focus on two qualities that make the Greek language unique. I think I can say that's fair, that make it like no other language, right? These two qualities are the continuity of the Greek language, right, and the refinement of the Greek language. When I say continuity, right, this has been mentioned already. The Greek language has been used continuously without interruption, right, at least for 3,000 years. If you include now the Linear B tablets that we've discovered from Mycenaean settlements across Greece, with the script of which reflects a protoform of Greece, the Greek language has been attested for 35 or 40 centuries, right, which is something that's completely unique in the world of language. Of course, there are other older languages, but they don't have this level of continuity, right, that they continue to be used, right? And the other element of the Greek language is its refinement. And when I say refinement, what I mean is that the Greek language is artificial. So ancient Greek and modern Greek are very similar to one another. As a matter of fact, in the last 2,000, 2,500 years, Greek has changed less than English has changed in the last 1,000 years, right? If you look, the Koine Greek, or this Atticizing Koine Greek of the New Testament, is still obviously the same language that's being spoken on the streets of Athens today. And this is not what you could say for a language like English. If you look at Beowulf or even Middle English, which is quite difficult for native speakers of English. Even something like Shakespeare is often very cited by people that have had to study him in school as something that's very difficult. So when I often get asked by my students, do the Greeks understand ancient Greek? Well, if you ask the Greeks themselves, they say no, right? But in the same way, if you ask anyone on the streets of DC or New York, a native speaker of English, if they understand Shakespeare, their answer would be no, right? And so it goes to show you that they're difficult, it's hard. this has the feeling of understanding, or not of understanding, is much more a product of the education, or the mode of education, or the failure to teach properly, than it is actually of the closeness of the language. Because no one would bat an eye if you'd like to learn how to read Shakespeare and you're not a native speaker of English, probably you would want to learn how to read and understand modern English first, right? You wouldn't just focus on learning Shakespearean English. But for some reason, when we come to Greek, especially when people that want to learn ancient Greek, we tell them, oh no, just focus on the language of Plato, right? Rather than actually learning the language of the modern Greeks. But